If you have an HOA and you're planning anything in your backyard this summer, stop. Just stop for 10 minutes and watch this video before you spend a single dollar. Because there are 10 things people are doing right now in their yards without realizing they're violating their community rules. And the fines aren't 50 bucks, they're hundreds, sometimes thousands. And I know folks who ended up paying more in fines than the entire project cost in the first place. A family in Florida paid over $100,000 for cutting down one tree in their own yard. Their property, their tree, 100 grand. The crazy part is that most people who get one of these letters had no idea they were doing anything wrong. They didn't read the bylaws when they bought the house. They saw their neighbor doing the exact same thing. The association didn't enforce it for years. I've been collecting the stuff that triggers these fines more than anything else. Because if you live in a community with rules and you're planning anything in your backyard this summer, you really want to know what's on this list before you start. Some of these are obvious. Some are flat out crazy. A couple of them genuinely surprised me when I dug into how widespread the rules actually are. Let me start with the one that catches people more than anything else. Fences. This sounds simple, but it's one of the biggest fine generators in the country. HOAs almost always have very specific rules about fence height, material, and color. 6 feet might be okay, 8 feet is not. White vinyl might be the only approved material in your community. Natural cedar might require prior approval. And painting your fence a color that wasn't on the approved list, even something tasteful like a deep gray, can get you a notice in the mail within a week of finishing the job. Here's the part nobody warns you about. Even if you replace your existing fence with the exact same type of fence the previous owner had, many communities require you to file a new application before you do it. The old approval doesn't transfer with the property. You take the fence down, that triggers the application requirement, and if you build the replacement before the paperwork goes through, that's a fine. The smart move before you touch a fence is to call the management company and ask for the current fence requirements in writing. A 5-minute phone call saves you months of letters. Speaking of letters, let's talk about sheds. The rules on backyard sheds are way stricter than most people realize. In a lot of communities, any structure over a certain size, sometimes as small as 100 square feet, requires both board approval and a city building permit. Some neighborhoods ban sheds completely. Others allow them, but only in specific colors and materials that match the house. A bright red prefab shed dropped into a community that requires earth tones can absolutely land you a fine, even if you bought it fully assembled at a big box store. Prefab sheds are kind of a trap, by the way. People assume because they're sold at the big stores and delivered ready to use, they must be allowed. The store isn't checking your bylaws for you. That's your job. Drop a $6,000 shed in your backyard and the management decides it doesn't comply. They can make you remove it at your cost. There are real stories of this happening. Trees are next, and I really want to flag this one because the fines in this category can be jaw-dropping and they catch people every single year. A lot of communities and a lot of cities classify certain trees as protected. Live oaks in the south, heritage trees in California, mature trees over a certain trunk diameter, basically everywhere. If you cut down a protected tree without permits and without approval, they can fine you by the inch of trunk diameter. I read about a homeowner in Coral Gables, Florida, who pulled one ficus out of his own property and ended up facing over $100,000 in fines. One tree. That kind of thing happens more often than you'd think, and it doesn't matter if the tree is dying. It doesn't matter if it dropped a branch on your car in the last storm. Most ordinances require you to file paperwork before any cutting starts, even in those cases. The right way to handle it is to contact the city arborist, or whoever your local tree authority is, and your HOA before any saw touches any bark. Get the approval in writing, then you call the tree service. Now this next one is going to surprise some of you. Front yard vegetable gardens. I know it sounds crazy. It's your yard, you should be able to grow tomatoes in it if you want. But a shocking number of communities explicitly ban visible food gardens out front. The reasoning, whether you agree or not, is that food gardens look messier and more seasonal than ornamental landscaping, and don't fit the manicured suburban look the board is trying to maintain. There have been pretty famous lawsuits over this. Families who replaced their front lawns with raised beds full of vegetables got fined repeatedly, ended up in the local news, and sometimes in court. A handful of states have actually passed laws protecting the right to grow food in your front yard. But across most of the country, your HOA can still tell you no. If you really want a productive garden, but you're in a neighborhood that restricts visibility, the workaround is something called foodscaping. You tuck edibles inside ornamental designs, blueberry bushes that look like regular shrubs, rainbow chard woven into a perennial border. I've talked about this on the channel before. It looks intentional. It doesn't trigger complaints. Same yield, no fine. Backyard chickens are next, and the rules here are all over the place. Some communities allow them, most don't. Some cities allow them, but only hens, no roosters, and only up to a certain number. Some bylaws require coops to be a specific distance from property lines, painted certain colors, and basically invisible from any neighbor's window. If you've ever thought about chickens, and I get the appeal because fresh eggs are genuinely amazing, the absolute first step is checking both your HOA bylaws and your city ordinances. There's a story I keep seeing pop up in different versions online. A family buys chickens for the kids, names every single one of them, builds the coop over a weekend, posts photos on Instagram, gets the letter 3 weeks later, and has to rehome the birds. The kids cry. The parents feel terrible. Don't put yourself in that situation. 5 minutes of paperwork first, pools come next, and the rules around backyard pools, especially above ground pools, are stricter than most people realize. A lot of neighborhoods flat out ban above ground pools because they are considered visually inconsistent with the rest of the homes. In-ground pools generally need both city permits and board approval, and the approval can take weeks, sometimes months. Skipping the permit and just digging is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make in a backyard. The city can force you to fill it back in at your cost. The HOA can fine you for every day the unapproved pool sits on the property. Even the safety fence around a pool is regulated. Most jurisdictions require a minimum 4-foot fence with a self-closing, self-latching gate around any pool. Some communities stack additional requirements on top of that. If your pool fence doesn't meet code, that's a fine. Sometimes a daily fine until you fix it. Outdoor kitchens and permanent fire features are next on the watch list, because the trend toward bigger outdoor cooking setups has slammed right into the wall of HOA rules and fire codes. A permanent built-in fire feature generally counts as a structure. Structures generally need both board approval and a city permit. Gas lines for outdoor kitchens almost always require permitted plumbing work, and there are often clearance rules about how far the fire pit has to sit from any structure, any combustible material, any property line. Building an outdoor kitchen on your own without checking can trigger multiple fines from multiple different authorities at the same time. The HOA, the city, sometimes the fire marshal. The frustrating part is that the average homeowner doesn't realize how much paperwork is involved until they're already halfway through the project. The contractor pours concrete, the contractor runs the gas line, then the inspector shows up and shuts the whole thing down. I've watched people end up ripping out $20,000 of work because nobody pulled the permit first. That's a brutal phone call to make to your spouse. Clotheslines, of all things, are still banned in a shocking number of communities. This one has always struck me as backwards, because hanging laundry out to dry is one of the most environmentally friendly things you can do. But plenty of boards consider visible clotheslines unsightly and ban them outright. The good news is that several states, including Florida, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii, have passed what are called right to dry laws that override these bans. If you're in one of those states, you're protected. If you're not, you might have to use a retractable line that puts away when it's not in use, or only hang laundry in a covered area where it isn't visible from the street. Party lights and seasonal decorations are another one. A lot of neighborhoods get homeowners on every year. Most communities allow decorations to go up about 30 days before a holiday and require them down within 2 weeks after. If your Christmas lights are still up in February, that can trigger a notice. If your Halloween inflatables are still in the yard in January, same story. This sounds petty until you find out that the fines often stack daily. $50 a day for a violation that runs for a month is $1,500 for lights you forgot to take down because life got in the way. The hard rule that solves the whole problem is this: one holiday's decorations come down before the next holidays go up. In boxes, put away. That's it. Artificial turf is the last one I want to flag because it's become a real flashpoint in the last few years. As more homeowners switch to fake grass to save water, more communities have been pushing back. Some ban artificial turf in the front yard outright. Others allow it, but only in specific colors, only in certain pile heights, only with specific drainage requirements written into the install spec. There are even neighborhoods that have written rules requiring real grass only and treating artificial turf as a code violation. So if you're considering it, don't assume your community allows it just because you've seen other yards with it on the next street over. Get it in writing from the management company before you spend the money. A quality artificial turf install can run you $20,000 or more. Imagine writing that check and then being told to rip it all out. All right, last thought before you go. What I want you to take away from this isn't that HOAs are the enemy. Most boards are made up of unpaid volunteers who are just trying to keep the neighborhood looking consistent. The real problem is that the rules are buried in documents nobody reads, and the consequences for missing one can get financially serious fast. Whether you love your HOA or you can't stand it, the move is the same. Before any backyard project bigger than planting a flower, read the section of your bylaws that applies, or just email the management company and ask directly. Most management companies will respond in writing within 1 week. That one email every time is what stands between a beautiful project and a stack of expensive letters in your mailbox. If you got something out of this, the next thing you absolutely need to watch is the one on cheap backyard privacy tricks. Because a lot of what triggers HOA fights starts with frustration over privacy. People put up the wrong fence trying to block a neighbor, and the fine shows up 2 weeks later. That video walks through 10 ways to get real privacy without touching anything that triggers your bylaws. I'll link it right here. Worth 15 minutes before you spend $1 on the wrong fix. See you over there.